All right, for our second watercolor technique, we're going to do wet on dry. Wet being wet watercolor and dry being the dry paper. So the original, the first technique I showed you, the wet on wet, is great for things like sky. Mine's still a little bit wet. I can kind of play around with it. It's great for things like sky or like large areas of color, but it's not great for detail. So sometimes you're going to need to work with some smaller detail, which is wet on dry, which is essentially just painting with watercolor. But it's being really conscious of how much water you're using on your brush and in your paint and on your paper. So knowing how much paint versus or water versus pigment are in your paint is going to help you. So here, what I want you to do is you've got this pigment that's been broken down with water. Make sure to put the tip of your brush into the actual pigment so you can touch that pigment. So you're not just putting the brush into the watery part. And test out what it's like to just paint with that color. You could also try using a smaller brush. If you have a teeny tiny brush, that can really help. Also try wiping your brush off and making sure it's very dry. If your brush doesn't have much water on it and all the water is coming from the paint, what happens is you end up with lots, a little bit more defined pigment. So let's say I wanted to paint a building. I've got a little purple on my brush. Make sure that you are cleaning off your brush and wiping it off. You don't want a soggy brush here. But now I could actually draw some smaller details if I'm trying to draw something. If I'm trying to draw a flower, I might want to, that looks a little too wet. I want to try to control how much moisture I'm using at a time. So I'm going to try to pick up a little bit of the pigment, not too much water. I'm going to draw my flower. And now I can get some better defined lines. So when this dries, then I could go ahead and fill this in with that wet on wet technique. I might want to do that a little bit later. I might show you that in a future video. But now I can get pretty much more painterly lines. And this won't happen with this much water that we used on wet. So you want to keep your brush dry, keep your paper dry, have your paint prepared with a little water here so that you get an actual good color, and then see what different amounts of paint will do. You can try blending, or you can even try drying these out just a little bit more. Like for instance, my black doesn't have much moisture, and so when I paint with that, it's almost like painting with an acrylic or a tempera paint. So if you wait until some of this water is really saturated into the pigment and there's not a big puddle right there, or try to use just the side where it's just some damp pigment, you're going to get some really good lines. So try drawing with a drier brush on dry paper with the sort of edge where it's just sort of moistened pigment. That's fun to say. All right, and that's your wet on dry technique.